Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The sun above Dry Creek was the kind of merciless that stripped the color from everything it touched. At noon, the heat shimmered like restless ghosts rising from the packed clay streets, and the only sound was the slow, rhythmic squeak of the water pump in front of the general store. Lydia Morgan was not used to walking into town alone. For years, her husband Eli had kept her close to the ranch, saying a woman had no business in public unless she was buying flour or burying someone. But this time was different. There had been no trip for supplies, no polite excuse for neighbors only. The sudden, brutal order to get out, and the shove that sent her and her 3 girls sprawling into the dirt. Before breakfast had even cooled on the table, her left cheek was swollen and purpled, her lower lip split. The baby, barely a year old, was tied to her chest with a faded shawl. The middle child clung to her skirt, her thumb in her mouth, wide eyes darting at every noise. The oldest, just 6, tried to look braver than she felt, holding a small rag. Doll with one missing button eye. They walked in silence down Main Street, boots stirring small clouds of dust that clung to their hems. People noticed. They always did. Old Mrs. Carver, sitting on her porch with her sewing, paused and squinted. A pair of men leaned against the saloon's porch rail, pretending not to stare while spitting tobacco juice into the street. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. Everyone in Dry Creek knew the Morgans. They knew Eli was a man with quick hands and a quicker temper, and they knew Lydia had failed him in the one thing he valued, bearing him a son. After the birth of the 3rd girl, his disappointment had turned to open contempt. Her head throbbed, and the heat made her dizzy. The water pump outside the general store gleamed like a promise. She approached, braced the handle with one shaking hand, and pushed down. The pump groaned, then coughed out a thin stream that filled the tin bucket at her feet. She lifted it, careful not to spill, and knelt so her oldest could drink first. That's when the shadow fell across her. It wasn't just a passing cloud. Dry Creek didn't have those in August. This shadow was tall, wide-shouldered, unmoving. Slowly, Lydia looked up. The man stood like he belonged in another time-broad chest under a faded brown duster, hat brim casting his eyes in shade. His face was weathered, the skin lined from years of sun and wind, but there was something about his gaze, steady, unreadable, that made her pause. A Colt revolver rested at his hip, not for show, but like it had been there so long it was part of him. "You're coming with me," he said, voice deep enough to carry without raising it. Lydia's first instinct was to recoil. She didn't know him, and after years with Eli, she had learned not to trust men who made decisions for her. Her arms instinctively tightened around the baby. The man didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He just stood, the heat rippling between them, his eyes scanning her face, then the children. Not with hunger, not with pity. Something else. "I don't know you," Lydia said, her voice hoarse. "Name's Boone. Silas Boone." He jerked his chin toward the horizon where the land rose in red bluffs. "Got a ranch out past Red Mesa. You look like you need to leave this town." Lydia's gaze darted to the saloon porch where the 2 men were still watching, one whispering to the other. To the store window where Mrs. Hendricks, the storekeeper's wife, stood frozen with her flour sack arms crossed tight. No one here. Was going to step forward. She didn't answer. Silas tipped his hat back just enough for her to see his eyes, gray, pale as weathered stone. "Ain't offering charity. Just a place to go where you won't get spit on for having daughters." Her breath caught. She hadn't told him anything. She hadn't needed to. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. The sound made her flinch, and Silas's eyes flicked toward it sharp, assessing, like a man who'd been in more than his share of bad situations. "You can walk back to whatever's waiting," he said, low and even. or you can ride out with me. I don't take to hitting women or children. You decide." The baby stirred against her chest. The oldest girl tugged her skirt, whispering, "Mama." Lydia looked down the road toward the Morgan Ranch, far beyond the edge of town. She could almost see the dust from Eli's boots, hear his angry voice. Her stomach turned. When she looked back up, Silas Boone was still there, waiting. Not pressing. Just waiting. And for the first time in years, she made a choice without asking permission. "All right," she said. Silas nodded once, like it was settled. He took the bucket from her hand, poured it over the pump trough for the horses tied nearby, then lifted her few belongings from where they'd fallen in the dirt. Without another word, he led her toward a battered but sturdy wagon at the edge of town. As she climbed onto the bench with her girls, Lydia realized she had no idea if she'd just saved them or stepped into another kind of danger entirely. But at least she wasn't walking back. The wagon creaked under its own weight as Silas Boone led it out of Dry Creek, the iron-shod wheels biting into the baked ruts of the road. The horses moved in an unhurried but steady rhythm, as if they knew they were leaving behind more than just a town. Lydia sat on the bench with the baby against her chest, her two older girls pressed close on either side, the middle one holding the doll as if it could shield her from the world. Silas didn't speak. He sat beside them, reins loose. In his weathered hands, eyes fixed on the horizon where the land shimmered under the heat. His hat shaded his face, but not enough to hide the lines carved deep around his mouth lines, made by years of keeping his thoughts to himself. They passed the last scattering of buildings, a leaning barn, a corral with a lone mule swishing at flies, and the sounds of town faded behind them. Out here, the wind carried only the rasp of grass and the far-off cry of a hawk. Lydia kept glancing sideways at him, searching for some clue as to why this stranger had stepped in, why he had decided today to interfere in her life. The truth was, Silas Boone had never planned on it. The ghost of Red Mesa people in Dry Creek told all kinds of stories about Silas. Some said he'd once been a bounty hunter. Others whispered that he'd fought in the border wars and never come home quite the same. But the truest thing anyone could say was that he'd been alone for a very long time. His ranch sat out past Red Mesa, a flat-topped bluff that caught the sunrise in fire-red light every morning. It was good cattle land, but too far from town for most men to bother with. Silas liked it that way. He'd built it with his own hands, back when his wife Clara was alive and their little boy Daniel was still small enough to ride on his shoulders. Prairie fever had taken them both in a single week, in a summer when the air hung heavy. And still, Silas had buried them in the shaded part of the north pasture, marked their graves with two plain wooden crosses, and never spoken of them again. Since then, the ranch had been a quiet, stubborn kind of life, sunrise to sunset, cattle to tend, fences to mend. He kept enough stock to live on, sold the rest to the rail buyers in the fall, and avoided town except for supplies. Conversation was rare, company rarer, but that morning, when he'd stepped onto Main Street for flour and salt pork, he'd seen Lydia Morgan trying to keep her girls from wilting in the heat, and something old inside him had stirred. He knew the look of someone with nowhere left to go. He'd seen it in the mirror more times than he cared to admit. The ride out the trail, out to Red Mesa, wasn't an easy one. A 2-hour ride over dry, cracked ground, broken by gullies and the occasional patch of stubborn mesquite. Lydia held the baby tight, every jolt of the wagon making the child fuss until Silas reached over without a word and handed her a small canteen. "Not much water between here and the mesa," he said, his voice low and even. "Best make it last." She nodded, avoiding his eyes. They rode in silence for a long stretch. The sun baked the top of the wagon bench, and sweat trickled down Lydia's neck. The older girls dozed, heads lolling against her sides. Every so often, Silas would shift, scanning the horizon like a man expecting company. His hand never strayed far from the rifle propped between them. Finally, Lydia broke the quiet. "Why?" Silas glanced at her. "Why what? Why take us?" Her voice was steady, but she was braced for whatever truth might come. He kept his eyes on the trail. "Figured you were better off leaving. Figured I could use the help." She studied him. "Help? Ranch work's more than one man can. Do. You can cook. Maybe help mend gear. Keep the house from falling in on itself." Lydia thought of her own house, the Morgan Ranch, and how little comfort it had given her. "And the girls?" she asked. "They can ride once they're steady enough in the saddle," Silas said. Then, after a pause, "And no one on my land's going to get hit for being born the wrong way." Something unknotted in her chest at those words, though she kept her expression guarded. Signs of trouble. They stopped once to let the horses drink at a shallow creek. Silas filled the canteens, then scanned the dusty road behind them. Lydia noticed it, the way he took in every ridge, and rise like a man counting the seconds before trouble arrived. "You expecting someone?" she asked. "Always." It was the kind of answer that said everything and nothing at once. They moved on, the mesa growing larger in the distance, its red stone glowing in the lowering sun. As they neared, Lydia saw the faint outline of fences, the glint of tin roofing. The place looked lonely, yes, but not neglected. The grass in the pasture was trimmed short by cattle, and the corral posts stood straight dot by the time they rolled into the yard. The shadows were long, and the air carried the smell of dry sage. Silas hopped down, unhitched the horses, and nodded toward the porch. "You and the girls can take the front room tonight. Tomorrow, I'll show you where things are." Lydia carried the baby inside, the wooden floor cool under her boots. The room was simple plain table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall. But it was clean. No overturned bottles, no stale stink of whiskey, no fist-shaped holes in the walls. She set the baby down and stood for a moment, listening to the silence. It wasn't the silence of waiting for a man to come home in a rage. It was the silence of a place that had forgotten how to be anything but quiet. Outside, Silas moved about the yard, tending to his animals, every motion steady, unhurried. 4. The first time in a long while, Lydia thought maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to breathe. The first weeks at Boone Ranch settled into a rhythm Lydia had almost forgotten existed. A rhythm without shouting, without the sound of boots pounding toward her in anger. Mornings began with the pale light of dawn spilling over red mesa, painting the land in soft gold before the sun's full weight burned it to white. Silas rose early, moving through the yard with quiet purpose. The girls would peer from the porch as he saddled his bay gelding, checked the pasture, and counted the herd. With a watchful eye, Lydia cooked breakfast eggs if the hens were obliging, cornbread most days, and sometimes she caught Silas hesitating in the doorway before taking his plate outside. As if the habit of eating alone was hard to break dot by the second week, she started helping with the work. She learned how to boil pitch to seal the corral posts, how to mend saddle straps with heavy thread and rawhide, and how to set a fence wire so tight you could pluck it like a fiddle string. Her hands toughened, her back ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from building, not from bracing for a blow. The girls adapted faster. The oldest, May, followed Silas like a shadow, asking about cattle brands and why the windmill turned so slow on still days. Ruth, the middle one, preferred the chicken yard, feeding the hens and collecting eggs with surprising gentleness. The baby, Sarah, found her place in a cradle Silas, built from spare pine boards, the smooth grain rubbed with linseed oil until it shone. For a time, it almost felt safe. The letter from Townet was a Tuesday when trouble began to show its teeth. Silas had gone into Dry Creek for flour, nails, and salt blocks for the cattle. Lydia was patching a tear in Ruth's dress when she saw the dust plume on the road long before she saw his wagon. When he returned, his jaw was tight, the lines around, his eyes deeper. He handed her the flour without a word and set the nails on the table. Then he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and laid it flat down. It was a letter, written in thick, uneven script. Boone, you've got what belongs to me. I'll be coming for it. Eli Morgan Lydia's stomach dropped. Silas watched her read it, his expression unreadable. Someone slipped it under the store door before I got there. Hendricks didn't see who. She swallowed hard. When? Soon, Silas said. That's the kind of man he is. He writes so you know he's coming, so you can sit here and stew on it. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper, but she forced her voice steady. We could go farther. Head west. Find a place. No, Silas said, firm but not unkind. You've run enough. He's banking on you doing it. Again, she didn't answer. Part of her wanted to argue, but another part deep down knew he was right. Running hadn't kept Eli away before. Preparing the ground from that day on, the ranch felt different. Silas moved with the same calm as before, but his eyes tracked every sound, the bark of a coyote, the whinny of a spooked horse, the faint echo of hoofbeats on the wind. He began making small changes. He shifted the horses to the upper pasture where the fence line met the rocks, harder for strangers to breach without being seen. He cleaned his rifle on the porch every evening, the soft click of the mechanism a steady reminder. He moved a second gun into the front room, tucked just inside the wood box by the stove. One evening, Lydia found him at the workbench in the barn, cutting strips of rawhide. For the gates, he explained. If someone tries to come through fast, these'll make it tricky. It was a strange thing, preparing for danger with someone who treated it like mending a fence, steady, methodical. No panic dot the conversation by the corral. It was near dusk when Lydia finally asked what had been gnawing at her since the letter came. She found Silas leaning against the corral fence, watching the sky shift to deep purple over the mesa. You could send us away, she said quietly. If we're not here, Eli has no reason to come. Silas didn't turn. That's not how men like him think. He's not coming for you because he wants you back. He's coming because you left without asking. She tightened her shawl against the cooling air. Then it's my fight, not yours. Now he did turn, meeting her gaze in the fading light. I've been waiting for trouble for 10 years, Lydia. Might as well be for something worth it. Something. In his voice steady, but with a weight behind it, made her throat tighten. She wanted to ask him what trouble he'd been waiting for, but the moment passed when Ruth called from the porch that the baby was crying. The night watch that night, Lydia lay awake with Sarah's warm little body curled against her. The girls. Breathing was steady, the air filled with the faint scent of sage and dry wood. Outside, she could hear the creak of the porch boards as Silas shifted his weight. He was out there, keeping watch, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the dark. She realized then that she didn't know if Eli would come tomorrow, or next week, or in the dead of winter. But she knew that when he did, there would be no running. For the first time in her life, she was ready to face what was coming. The morning Eli Morgan came, the air felt wrong. It wasn't the heat, though August could still scorch, even this close to the mesa. It was the stillness. No wind, no birdsong. The sky was a flat sheet of pewter, heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Silas Boone noticed it first. He was on the porch before dawn, hat low over his eyes, a steaming mug in one hand and his rifle across his knees. By the time the sun edged over the horizon, his gaze was fixed eastward on the faint smear of dust rising from the flat road. Lydia stepped out quietly, her shawl wrapped tight. "Is it him?" Silas didn't answer right away. He just took a slow sip from his mug and set it on the railing. "It's him." The riders arrive. They came in a loose line, Eli in the lead, 4 men behind. All carried rifles or shotguns, their horses lathered from hard riding. Eli's wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, but Lydia could see the set of his shoulders, the same posture he'd had when walking toward her in anger. When they stopped at the edge of the yard, Eli swung down, boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. He didn't look at Lydia, he looked at Silas. "Boone," he called, his voice carrying across the dry space between them. "You've got something of mine." Silas rose slowly from the porch chair, resting the rifle barrel against his shoulder. "You've got a mistake in your thinking. Ain't nothing here that belongs to you." Eli spat into the dust. "That woman is my wife. Those girls are my blood. They're free," Silas said evenly. "And they're staying that way." The first shot, the pause that followed, was taut as a drawn bowstring. Lydia felt every muscle in her body tense, her heart pounding so hard she thought the men in the yard might hear it. Eli's gaze flicked to the rifle in Silas's hands. "You planning to fight me over what's mine?" "I don't fight over property," Silas said. "I fight over people worth protecting." Eli's lip curled, and he moved his hand toward the butt of his revolver. The crack of the rifle shattered the stillness. Silas's first shot wasn't at Eli. It was at the man to his left, the one trying to bring up a shotgun. The man went down hard, dust blooming around him. The yard erupted into chaos. Eli's remaining men scrambled for cover, firing wild. One bullet splintered the porch post inches from Silas's shoulder. Another hissed past Lydia, making her duck behind the doorway. Rain and gunpowder, the storm finally broke. Fat drops of rain hissed as they hit the hot earth, turning the air thick and metallic. Mud began to form in shallow ruts where the wagon had once sat, but neither side stopped shooting. Silas moved with deliberate precision, no wasted shots. Another of Eli's men went down clutching his leg, screaming. One bolted entirely, spurring his horse toward the horizon. Eli tried circling toward the barn, but Silas caught the movement and sent a bullet whistling past his ear, forcing him to dive for cover. Inside the house, Lydia grabbed the shotgun from beside the stove. She'd never fired at a man before, but when one of Eli's men broke for the porch, she stepped forward, aimed low, and squeezed the trigger. The blast knocked him backward into the mud, his weapon skittering from his grasp, got through the smoke and rain. Silas caught her eye and gave the barest nod, a wordless acknowledgment. Face to face at last. Only Eli was left standing. His arm was bleeding where a bullet had grazed him, and the rain plastered his shirt to his frame. He stood in the yard, chest heaving, his revolver hanging loose in his good hand. "You think you've won?" Eli snarled. "I know I have," Silas said. He stepped down from the porch, closing the distance until he was only a few paces away. His rifle stayed trained on Eli's chest. "You set foot on this land again," Silas said, his voice calm. "But carrying you'll leave in a pine box. You understand me?" Eli's eyes burned with pure hate, but something in Silas's tone, or perhaps the certainty in his aim, made him step back. Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the rain. Aftermath. Silas lowered the rifle, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. The yard smelled of wet earth and gunpowder. Lydia stepped out from the doorway, the shotgun still in her hands, though her arms trembled now. "You and those girls are safe," Silas said, not as a promise, but as a fact. She looked at him, really. Looked at him, and saw more than the hard, solitary man who'd first found her at the water pump. She saw the man who'd chosen to stand in front of danger instead of beside it. Without thinking, she stepped forward and took his rough, rain-cold hand in hers. Not in thanks alone, but in a quiet understanding. Behind them, the storm eased, the last drops pattering onto the roof. Somewhere out in the pasture, the cattle began to low, as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath. For the first time in years, Lydia felt that same release inside her. The fear was still there. Fear always lingered, but it no longer owned her dot, and for Silas Boone, the lonely rancher of Red Mesa, the long winter in his heart had finally broken.